the February 8th, 2023 Planning Commission meeting to order at 6:02 p.m. Ms. Pinyard, will you call roll, please?
Chair Heberlein.
Here.
Olive Gallagher.
Here.
Nicole Hendricks.
Here.
Andrew Carr.
Here.
Cameron Mesbah.
Here.
Catherine Neal.
Here.
Jennifer Willard.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now is the time that we will stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. This is the time that citizens have the opportunity to address the Planning Commission regarding any item that is not already scheduled for a formal public hearing tonight. Therefore, if any member of the audience, either here in City Hall or via Zoom, would like to speak about any work session item or any other matter of concern, please raise your hand or send a message to the recorder using the Zoom chat function so that we may hear from you now.
But I'll note, Chair, that if it's okay, we may want to do some of the public comment after we present the work session, if that's agreeable to the chair.
Yeah, that's acceptable. All right, does not look like we have anybody right now, so we'll move to the next item. Next item is the administrative matters and consideration of the January 11th, 2023 Planning Commission minutes. The minutes were previously distributed. Are there any corrections to the minutes?
Passed mine already. It had to do with the gross presence of planning director at the last meeting.
Okay, so it looks like we need to amend the minutes to remove Ms. Bateshell from the attendee list. All right, I guess we need a motion to approve the amended minutes.
I move to approve the amended minutes for January 11th.
All right. Any discussion? Ms. Bateshell, looks like you had something you may have wanted to say. No, you're good? Okay. All right, looks like we need a vote. All in favor of approving the amended minutes?
Aye.
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 Any nays? Any abstains? Motion passes. Thank you. Okay. Looks like next up on the agenda is our first work session item, Frog Pond East and South Implementation Transportation System Plan with Mr. Polly.
Thank you. This is one of a number of implementation steps for the Frog Pond East and South Master Plan that was adopted the end of last year. You already know well the development code work we're doing. This is another step. This is the Transportation System Plan Amendment. So fairly straightforward, taking the projects from the master plan and putting them into the transportation system plan. So with us tonight, we have Jenna Bogert and Scott Manser from DKS and Associates. They'll do most of the presenting. And so with that, I'll go ahead and start the presentation and turn it over to them. Appreciate them being here. Let me share the screen here.
Great. Can you hear me all right, Dan?
Yep.
Perfect. So, great. So good evening, Planning Commission members. Tonight, we are walking through the revisions to the city's transportation system plan, the TSP, related to the recently approved Frog Pond East and South Master Plan. We will start off with talking about why a TSP amendment is needed and what even is a TSP. And then we'll focus on the chapters of the TSP where the bulk of the revisions will be. So that would be chapters 3 and chapters 5. And then we'll open it up to you all at the end to ask any questions. Dan, if you could jump to the next 2 slides. Perfect. So what is a TSP? It's a transportation system plan. It's the city's long-term policy and planning document for transportation improvement projects. And having a TSP in place is essential for the city to compete for federal, state, regional funding and grants for those transportation projects. This amendment to the TSP is required as part of the Frog Pond East and South Master Plan, similar to how we've amended the TSP for the Town Center Plan and the Basalt Creek Concept Plan. All of those projects from those other plans, like Frog Pond East and South, have been folded into the TSP. I just want to clarify that this amendment will only include changes related to the Frog Pond East and South Master Plan. We didn't make any other changes or updates to the document. For example, we didn't go through and remove any completed projects that have been built or constructed since 2013. This just keeps it a clean way to get those projects into the TSP again to focus on getting funding for them. So next slide, please. So Chapter 3 has the city's transportation system standards. There are a handful of figures that we went through and updated to reflect the Frog Pond East and South neighborhood. So figure 3-1 there shows the city's roadway jurisdiction, or shows the roadway jurisdiction for the streets within the city of Wilsonville. So it indicates whether the street is owned by City of Wilsonville, County, or ODOT. And we went through that figure and updated the city limits and the UGB boundary to be reflective of what the current boundaries are today. Those were out of date. We also updated figure 3-2, which is the city's functional street classification map. It shows where the arterials and collectors and local streets are within the city. And so we updated that figure to reflect the future and existing collector and arterial street system in the east and south neighborhood, which is shown in the figure there on the right. And then figure 3-5 is a map of the city's bicycle routes and facilities within the city of Wilsonville. So that figure was also updated to reflect the existing and again future desired bicycle facilities on the east and south neighborhood collectors. So the desire for those protected bicycle lanes and multi-use paths and things like that. Next slide. Also in Chapter 3, another hopefully familiar figure to you is these are the cross-section street standards from the Frog Pond Master Plan directly pulled out of it. The Chapter 3 has the standards for cross-sections in Wilsonville, but because Frog Pond East and South has a couple of unique cross-sections, we wanted to fold those into the plan to make sure that those stood out as unique to the Frog Pond East and South neighborhoods. So we have cross-sections for the Stafford Road arterial, the Advance Road collector, 60th Avenue collector, both north of Advance Road and south of Advance Road, and then the Brisbane Main Street, which will be along that commercial and retail area in the east neighborhood, and then a local street cross-section south on the south end of the Meridian Creek Middle School. So that local street is very similar to local streets in Wilsonville. It just has that extra wide multi-use path on the right side of the street cross-section shown there. So those are now folded into the city's TSP. Chapter 5 is focuses on the transportation improvement projects. The city's transportation improvement projects are broken into two categories. The first is a high priority project list, and the second is a lower priority project list, also known as the additional planned projects. All of the all of the Frog Pond East and South projects that were identified in the plan are on the high priority project list in the TSP. So those all got put on that high priority list so that they can be prioritized for funding and improvements.
I will note.
I will walk.
If I could, real quick, Jenna, I will note, you may note on this that the enhanced pedestrian crossing at Frog Pond Lane isn't shown here. That's not intentional. That is intended to still be in there, and that'll be updated.
Yes. were 8 transportation projects that we added to the high priority list, and I will walk through those 8 projects briefly. So RE12C is a project for the construction of those neighborhood collector roads in Frog Pond East neighborhood. RE17, RE stands for roadway extension, just for clarification. RE17 is for the construction of the Brisbane Main Street in that east neighborhood, which would be constructed per the cross-section that we've shown in Chapter 3. Project SI 12, 13, and 14. SI stands for spot improvement. Those projects are for the single-lane roundabouts at Stafford and Collie, and Stafford and Brisbane, and then Advance Road and 60th Avenue. So those 3 locations on the map that have those green circles. And then the last 3 projects are for ped and bike improvements. BW21, BW stands for biking and walking. That project is for a mid-block pedestrian crossing near the future park. So when development occurs in the east neighborhood, it's a crossing that will allow families to get from the north side of Advance Road to the south side of Advance Road where the park will be. BW22 is for the rectangular rapid flashing beacon on Advance Road. That would be located along Advance Road, and it would be determined at a later date when the development has occurred and we've gotten an idea of where people are wanting to cross, and we would put that push button activated crossing at that location. And then lastly, SR stands for Safe Routes. That's a Safe Routes to School project. That would be the addition of a school crosswalk at the entrance to the Meridian Creek Middle School entrance. There currently is not a crosswalk there today, again, because there's no need for anyone to be crossing Advance Road, but as development occurs in that east neighborhood, there will be a rising need for families to get and students to get across Advance Road to and from the school. So that is the summary of the projects in Chapter 5 and the changes that we're making to the TSP to get the Frog Pond East and South Master Plan folded into it. And Scott and I are available for any questions.
And Dan, just to clarify, I think what you were pointing out is on the Urban Upgrade Project 6 on Stafford Road, there will be a protected pedestrian crossing at Frog Pond Lane, correct?
Yes.
We should have that pedestrian symbol there.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Frog Pond Lane in Stafford.
Yes. I think, Jen, that's part of Urban Upgrade 6, Project 06, but we probably should have the symbol there because that is part of that project, just for clarification.
Yeah.
So, good catch, Dan. Thank you.
That was, I'm relaying Zach's comment, so. And maybe I'll leave it for questions on the actual map. So I think that'll be more helpful.
Shall I start?
Go for it.
I believe I just have one, but I reserve the right to ask two. If you go to the slide that shows the cross-section planned for Advance Road, the maps are inconsistent for me. One of them leads me to think that that is the cross-section that we would expect along the length of Advance Road that's affected by Frog Pond. And the other one, it looks like it's only going to go up to 60th. And so is this going to be the cross-section we will see east of 60th?
So there is, the master plan does give some discretion to the city engineer of where there's actually the exact final design. Zach, do you recall on this one? Great question.
Hey, good evening. Zach Weigel, city engineer. Yeah, so that cross-section, one of the discussions we've had is to see how development occurs, to whether those bike lanes need to be extended past, I guess, east of 60th, because the urban reserve, I guess, if I'm using the correct term, ends there, so there will be no future expansion to the east.
So essentially, the bikes would go up onto that shared path from there to connect into the regional trail system, because there really isn't a bike destination to the east.
I see. I was thinking more that the road transition acts as an additional traffic calming feature, so that way people just start slowing down when they hit that neighborhood area. That's where my thought process was.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments from the commission? Dan, if you can go back 2 slides. This is just a clarification for me. Oh, that one, sorry. Next one. Yeah.
This one?
Yeah. So the definition of major arterial versus minor arterial versus collector, that's driven by traffic counts, is what would drive that? Is that correct? Or what's the rationale for a red and a blue going into 2 yellows?
Zach, you may be...
So I think you're referring to like the Beckman and Wilsonville Road
Correct.
examples. Yep. A lot of times that has to do with really the function and what you're trying to use it. And the reason you're seeing Beckman and Wilsonville Road as minor arterials is we wanted those to be narrower streets. There's a lot of residential along them. And so typically a lot of it has to do with the design of the road and kind of what you're trying to provide services and function of the street to the traveling public. And so, for example, the Beckman and Wilsonville Road, those are minor arterials because we want those, we want medians, we want those to be slower, narrower streets, and typically your major arterial are your wider and faster streets.
Okay. Is the street layout on Beckman significantly different than that on Advanced Road? Because they look similar, but we've got different classifications for them.
Yeah, I mean, in that situation of Advanced Road, it's just providing kind of access to the streets. It's not a major from a volume standpoint, and it's not a major east-west through street, and that's why we've had that collector option to the east of Stafford Road on Advance.
Okay. All right, thank you.
I do have one question.
Go for it.
Thanks. And thanks, Jenna and Scott, for the presentation. I just noticed, in the master plan, it talks about, smart transit kind of going through the neighborhoods. And so I was just curious about, I guess, what considerations were in the street standards that support, public transit or kind of buses going through and circulating through the neighborhood, or that main street specifically, I guess, I think was mentioned.
Jenna, do you recall the coordination with SMART on? I know we did as far as Frog Pond Lane in the Frog Pond West. The routing that we had showed kind of a loop that they'll be doing as the construction and as the neighborhood gets developed. And I believe our the same area, we've got kind of a loop there that buses can come and circulate around both the north and south portions of Frog Pond.
Yeah, I know that in the master plan there's a transit figure that shows the kind of planned loop through the east neighborhood that takes you, I believe, down the main street, and then it comes down into the south neighborhood and it has a stop near the school. But yeah, I think as far as the cross-section design goes, those are sized to accommodate, transit buses and school buses, and the pedestrian multimodal facilities too are also comfortable for pedestrians to get to those bus stops. Dan, I don't know if you have anything else you want to add?
No, and we did coordinate that routing with SMART, and especially south around the middle school, I mean, those are facilities that will be used by city buses and school buses.
Cool. Thanks, that answers my question.
I can add a tiny extra bit of detail, whether it's pertinent or not. Well, it is pertinent, but I don't know if it's necessary or not. But during the town center planning, we spent a lot of time working with SMART about the design of streets and the cross sections for different streets, including the main street, in order to accommodate bus traffic and bus stops where needed. So, and the main street design here utilizes the cross section. It borrows it and slightly modifies it, but borrows it from there. Does provide some on-street parking, which also provides the spacing needs if we do have a pull-out bus stop in that area.
Awesome, thank you.
Hi, is there an expectation of a change of the traffic pattern once Boakman is redesigned and the dip is removed? Because that's a pretty heavy traffic street right now from Boakman to Stafford. Is there any expectation that that will shift?
Yes, as the curvature of that road and that roadway gets improved, you will see an increase in traffic, especially as Frog Pond, the houses continue to get constructed and occupied. So you will see an increase of traffic in Beckman from where it is today.
Yeah, but nothing beyond the projects that we've identified already in the TSP. Those projects will be able to manage that level of traffic. But yeah, you will get to have bus and transit routes that can use the Beckman area now. I don't think that's something they can do today, so that'll be a benefit.
Yeah, as part of the Frog Pond plan, we use the city's travel demand model, and that evaluates the long-term, the 20-year expected growth within the city, and then that traffic volume is modeled, and that future year model assumed the improvements on Beckman and those future traffic volumes, and that's where some of the recommendations for the transportation improvements in the Frog Pond plan came from those future projections from the model.
All right, looks like we're good from a questions and comments perspective. Jenna, Scott, thank you. We appreciate your time here tonight and the presentation. All right, Mr. Polly, looks like you're up again for Frog Pond East and South for the development code.
Yes. And so this will be another step to the implementation. This is our second of a series of work sessions on this topic. We've kind of tried to package it together. I think we're looking at 3, maybe 4 packages that we'll bring forward, and then we'll spend at least a couple work sessions kind of working through iterations. Because, I mean, we talked initially about the concepts, how it's laid out, but we're still getting feedback. We're still looking at how things interrelate, so there's still going to be some iterations on these things and finalizing particularly some of the numeric standards. So we have a game plan, but this is the second package that we're talking about tonight. And with me again is Kate Rogers from MIG. Appreciate her efforts on this, and she knows development codes and very well, and appreciate her support in this effort. So what the second package tonight is, we're building on the foundation we talked about last time, where we talked about the categorization, or putting in buckets the different unit types, and how that relates to housing variety, which is definitely a big theme from the master plan, where we wanted to require to put a limit on the percent of one type, as well as require a percent of target types. And we're looking at that at a development-wide scale, so a larger scale, but also on a block scale. And another detail that we'll get into tonight is, okay, how does ensuring compliance of that look over the lifetime of a project? As you may recall from the master plan, there was a specific memo that was prepared that's now in the appendix about encouraging ADUs and what can be done to encourage ADUs. So we'll talk more about what code edits are being done to integrate ADUs into the project and encourage them. Also, the integration, we talked about accessibility of units. We've searched for good names. The current name we're using is mobility-friendly units, and talk about how we are integrating those. So as last time, I'll pause on each of these to get any immediate feedback. We can always circle back at the end as well. And then as stakeholders in the public have comments we can circle back to any of these, of course, as well. So as is in your packet, and I'll touch on tonight, really want to look at the intent. Why are we doing this from the...
I'm going to share your screen.
Thank you.
I didn't want to let it go on too long.
I think I'm about 75% of the time I remember to share my screen. Hopefully my average is that good. So we're looking at the intent, explaining kind of what we're doing, and talking about what actually the draft amendment is. So expected outcome as last one, really looking from some guidance generally. Is it ready to, with tweaking some numbers and such, but generally the right approach, ready to do some final refinement or to direction on next steps, because maybe there's still quite a bit of work to do to really get to where we want to be for a package for adoption. So let's jump into housing variety. First of all, the development level. And I don't know if development level is the best term, but let me clarify what I mean by that. Not like project or neighborhood wide, but that's more when a project comes in, when a developer essentially proposes a subdivision or a series of subdivisions, that we're looking at the variety within that. Those of you that are familiar with terminology that we use as we review it through DRB, which a number of you are, we're talking stage one, which is kind of the master plan bubble diagram, where across all of our zones, we're usually, that's where we're talking about what the different uses are. So if you're doing a master plan, like in an industrial area, maybe that's where you're identifying where you have office versus warehouse, or retail in commercial retail versus commercial office. So, and as we talk about that, again, want to touch on, as you have in your packet, these 4 categories, because this is, again, the basis of what we're talking about. Category A, briefly, that's our what most people would call apartments or similar condo-type buildings. Unit B is our attached middle housing, primarily townhouses, but also duplexes, quadplexes. Category C is small, detached, or ADUs. Again, this 1,200 square feet, that's still in flux. We've started talking about that, doing some more research, but in a future work session, we'll still come back with a refinement of is 1,200 really the right threshold, or is there something different? And then our final category is primarily detached single-family homes and similarly sized units that are detached. So how this is presented in the code to get this variety, and let me kind of walk through this, is a number of things are in this table. First of all, to get the, let me talk about the thresholds of where the different levels of variety apply. So this is, again, 4.5 acres of gross development area of the stage 1 area, as we call it, which is consistent with other zones. And so we'd anticipate this 4.5 acre threshold that's specifically chosen because there's a number of like 4.5 acre properties in Frog Pond South. So we'd expect the vast majority of Frog Pond East and South to come in in a stage 1 area, 4.5 acres or more. But there are some smaller things, so we put in put in standards for the smaller developments. So as you go across to meet master plan standard, the minimum number of unit categories, 3, so you have to at least have like townhouses, single family, and something else. In these 4.5 acres or more. And for something to count, there's a footnote that I'll note later, but it has to be at least 5% of the net development area to really count as one of the categories. So you can't do a token unit here and then essentially do 50-50 of 2 other unit types. The other one really drives directly at that language that we've discussed in the master plan of not having a majority of a single unit type and limiting those unit types. And then the third one, this 20%, that is the requirement for the target. So B and C are really those target areas. That's the attachmental housing and those small detached units. But in this, trying to allow balance, having that level of flexibility and allow developers to also to not be overly prescriptive, but allow a functional amount of flexibility. What we really did for the smaller ones, noting that you're going to be smaller, and so if you have a couple townhouse buildings, for example, you're going to already be starting to take up a lot of land on a smaller project. So we reduced the number of required unit categories, allowed one to go up to 75% just because of the nature of a smaller site, and then only 10% of the target categories. And then if it's less than 2 acres, there's really not a requirement, just as may be required by our block variety standards we'll get into here in a minute. Some key footnotes that we put in there that you'll want to note is that affordable housing is exempt. So if someone comes in with, let's say, a 3-acre project to do an affordable rental project, then it can be all the same if it meets those thresholds. I'll touch on this again, but the incentives for ADUs really, as we work through this, the way they're categorized in Category C, anticipate that a lot of Category C would actually be met with ADUs, and so really encouraging ADUs that this is a tool that we're using for that. Special provisions, I've talked about small developments, but also developments that are mostly type 1, because when you start talking into those larger buildings, they take up more land. A single building takes up more land, so it made sense to really adapt where 75% or more of a stage 1 area is type 1, then you actually you require less variety, so you're able to actually put in those larger buildings that are typical for a type 1 area. Now I mentioned that you need to use 5% for it to count as a category. So you're not, so I mean, that's fairly conservative. That's not a lot, but it's more than just a token unit.
Dan, not to interrupt, but you may want to clarify the affordable housing exemption and what qualifies as affordable housing.
Yeah, so thank you. So we're talking below 80% median family income for at least 10 years. As the goal is what really is, and we've talked to council and in the master plan, really as we've set these zoning standards, the goal is to not create any barriers to affordable housing. Actually, while we don't have funding necessarily yet, and we'll pursue that, but we don't want to get funding and then have zoning barriers to that. So that's really what we're trying to avoid.
You lost me a little bit with the 4-10 years portion of that.
So essentially usually when you talk about affordability, there's a sunset date where it has to maintain that affordability for a certain period. Yes.
When you talk about affordability for 10 years, are you talking about the entire complex or an individual lease?
So it'd be So this is for a affordable housing. So that's a good question. If we're going to apply this, if it's a mixed income project, we don't have a threshold there, but we can think about adding that. But generally, as this is written, we're anticipating it to be 100% affordable project.
For the building.
For the building or series of buildings.
I have a question about the ADU incentives.
Yeah.
And just the category, the C category. Do you anticipate like ADUs being the cottage cluster, just be a cluster of ADUs, or ADUs just addition to a house that's on some land?
So essentially, a cottage cluster would be a collection of ADU-sized buildings, but really the ADU is like a single cottage that's accessory to a larger home on a lot, or next to a larger home on a lot. We can over here. Just making a note here before I forget. Again, we can come back to this. Anything else on this initial housing variety, or actually maybe go around and get initial thoughts on this if we can, Chair?
Yeah.
I can go back to the main table.
Commissioner Carr?
I am liking the 4.5 acre and more being treated slightly different than the smaller one to allow for more variety and more types. I think overall this looks good.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Hendricks?
Yeah, I agree with Commissioner Carr. I'm supportive so far. And I was just going to ask too about that, like, yeah, the kind of logic behind the 5%, why we landed at 5% for the, yeah, the minimum. Thanks.
Because we didn't want it to, it's really trying to, I mean, a number that is more than a single unit.
Yeah.
But it's not so much that it kind of runs into other standards.
Okay.
Yeah, so kind of making sure that it's more than just like a token unit, but keeping it low enough that it doesn't conflict with other standards.
Okay.
So Dan, just a quick add-on to that. So in a 2-acre gross development area, how many units do you think that 5% would equate to?
In 2 acres?
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking, I mean, even if you're talking, like, if someone preferred detached homes, I mean, you're talking, let's say even a 4,000 square foot lot, you're talking minus 2 acres plus take out the right of way and such, do some quick math, so let's say 60,000 square feet divided by, so maybe 8 units, 9 units. So you'd have to have, you could have 6, let's say, detached homes, and then maybe a duplex, triplex building. Maybe what you end up with in there.
Okay. So you'd get down to that very close to a couple of units in that small development if it was a 5% threshold.
Right.
Just rough numbers.
That's why they had the only 2 unit categories.
Yeah.
Because if you spread it to 3 unit categories,
you really, you start to run into, have conflicts with the different standards.
You'd run out of acreage.
Yeah. Okay, that helps. Thank you.
I'm in support of what's here in the proposal.
Me too.
I have what she's having.
Okay. Do I have anything? Oh boy, I got to come up with something in contrary.
And I imagine that some of our audience may have some comments about this too, so.
No, I think I'm good.
Okay. So let's talk block level, and this one's I mean, I think the development level has been fairly straightforward to think through. I think that was very clear in the master plan, kind of what the expectations were there. Block level has been a little trickier. I've already gone through kind of 2 iterations of approaches, and I'm not going to pretend there's probably not going to be another iteration or maybe another option beyond what's presented here. And so, but I want to talk about kind of what the intent is here. And I remember particularly Commissioner Carr talked about this and others, is really to reduce segregation by unit type. So, if you're essentially almost 50% townhouses and 50% single family, they're not just like on opposite sides of the street. There's actually, each block has some mixture, some variety to mix the product types. So, one idea is really require a number of categories based on the number of units in a row, essentially. So want to make this kind of administratively easy to understand and workable. And so if you have 5 or less, you're fine having all the same. If you have 5 to 12, which is a typical number that oftentimes you fall into, you'd have to have 2. But again, there's no minimum here. You just, as long as you have one, like one unit has an ADU or something, then you're going to be able to meet it. If you have more than 12, which, in practice is going to be fairly rare, you'd have 3 units required. Now, you have to think about townhouses a little differently, because we don't want to, if you have townhouses, of course, those lots tend to be smaller, and so you'd have more of those along. So really, we're thinking about townhouse buildings as the entire lot. One thing that's come up in conversation since this was published is the idea is, what if you have another unit type across the street? That makes sense, because usually, you think of your street, your neighborhood, not just about your neighbors on your side of the street, but your neighbors on the other side of the street. So I think at least to add to this, that you'd be able to count an additional unit if a certain number of those units exist on the block face directly across the street. So, which can happen. So, that can be beneficial from a development standpoint, because maybe you have, this side of the street's front loaded, where front driveways facing the street. So maybe you tend to have more detached homes. You have like 3 or 4 detached homes there, but then across the street is alley loaded. So that ends up being the townhouses. But that street, especially as a local street, you still have a lot, end up having the variety of unit types on that street. So that is what we're aiming for, and any additional ideas, or kind of if we're heading in the right direction, and we'll continue to refine this.
A question. So how is this going to work with 2 different owner lots? Are we going to anticipate that within an owner lot, they will have all of the roads and blocks together, or are the across the street going to be one owner?
So in that case, if you don't know the future across the street, you're not going to be able to take advantage of that. So likely it'd be either or, right? You could meet it all on one side of the street, or if it's like internal to a subdivision and you're going to do something else across the street, then you can go ahead and
by doing the variety on my side of the street would, in essence, counter that the other owner would have to have a similar variety on their side of the street if the street is the separation of our properties. Okay, all right.
Would it, or would that allow the person that develops last to not have the variety, because the variety was already met on one side of the street?
But I'm not going to be able to have as many of one unit. I'm going to have to maintain that same variety. Or will I not? It's a good question.
So the standard hasn't been written yet. I think at this point, we are talking about the opportunity to count in line, but also to count across the street. So there's in part, we'd probably look for some guess, feedback from you in terms of whether you want that future development, the development that happens later, to be able to count it, because what we've really discussed is about getting the overall variety and block level variety, and I guess the question would be, does it matter in which order in which that happens? That's part of the question for you. That later development would still have to meet all of the development level variety standards. So they'd still be required, if they're a larger development, to have to do at least 3 different housing unit categories. They'd still have to, hit the percentages, the maximum percentages and the minimum percentages at the development level. So it's really the question then at the block level, it's a policy question about whether you still want to require that later developer to have additional variety along just their inline frontage, or if you want to essentially allow the developer who's already developed and that variety that's presented to be allowed to count towards that block variety. And really it's a question to some degree, I guess, about timing of development and thinking that through, but part of it's really about what is the end goal, and if the end goal is just getting the variety, then maybe the later development, you're still going to get the variety at that block level. It's just a matter of whether you get, I guess, additional variety or not.
So
If that makes sense.
How many instances where there's going to be multiple owners on opposite sides of the street are we going to run into?
It's going to be a fair amount.
Because the smaller...
More in south than in east.
More in south.
More in south, but...
So can we change it by south?
Well, in south you have, is this still on?
Doesn't sound like it's on.
My light is on.
I can hear
Hold
you.
on.
There you go.
Well, the light's off now.
There.
How about now?
There, I can hear you.
Okay. In south, you have 60th, and 60th is going to have the park and the school property.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think about how, I think maybe it's a good question, and I think that on 60th, you may run into it more, but even then, you're only talking about a portion of 60th, and then a portion of the east-west street that's to the south of the school.
Can we-
Those are the only 2 streets in south, isn't it? Without seeing a map,
Yeah, I mean, you still have your little local streets, but there's variety there. Yeah, well,
Can we add something where there are instances where 2 different owners are on opposite sides of the street to maintain variety across both developments?
yeah,
In other words, say something like where the instance where 2 owners are on opposite sides, you can't count the other side of the street for your variety. The variety has to be within your development.
well, there's 2 different varieties, so they still have to meet their variety, like that, the percentages in the table.
Sure.
But from a block level, I mean, and once it's all built out, I mean, do people care or know who built what? From a functional standpoint.
so the answer to Commissioner Carr's question is we could.
We could, yeah.
We could.
Is it worth it though?
And I think the question, and you may want other commissioner input on whether that is something we want to add or not.
I have a question just about the type 1 housing on this. What if somebody's coming in and doing a, 25 building, apartment building? How are you going to get the variety on that one street if it's just this one big complex?
Well, the point is, we wouldn't want or expect to see 25 buildings in a row in an apartment complex. And this is built, I mean, for a small to medium, I mean, if you have 5 buildings in a row, I mean, I wouldn't expect to see more than 5 buildings in a row. And from what we've heard and talked about in Frog Pond, that wouldn't be an outcome that is desired.
So I would clarify, I think part of the question I'm hearing from Commissioner Neal is what you'd want to look at is these sub-bullets, and they really refer to the number of lots that are in line and not necessarily the number of units. And the way it's drafted in the standards that you're not seeing up here on this slide is that once you have a separation of a street, they're no longer in line with one another, right? Because we're at a block level. And so you wouldn't have more than that many lots of a multifamily or type 1 because you'd have a street or a park or some other entity that would separate into another block, and then you would start with another kind of inline of lots to consider.
So yeah, this would really come into more play when you're talking like detached homes on individual lots, and then when you're talking about, block length apartment buildings or something like that.
In general, it feels like this is really going to come into play along 60th, in South, on the east side of the school and the park, where you have a long row, and they're smaller parcels right now, that they're going to be gobbled up in different rates at different times, potentially. And so that's where it's going to come into play. And that one line, one road, those are the size of those lots, doesn't seem amenable to having block level variety. It's going to have to be along the whole road, not just along the one parcel. I hope that.
Yeah, so you are going to have it broken up by streets and such. So really, the block lengths, which you have standards for maximum block lengths in the code. So I mean that interacts with this as well.
Okay.
So I mean maximum. I mean, as I did the even studies and I did kind of tested this out on like Villebois, rarely did you get over 12. Mostly you're either 5 or less or 5 to 12 on most blocks. Because the in line, I mean, once it's broken up, as Miranda said, by Ms. Bayshell said, by a street or an open space, which you have quite a few of, then you kind of reset and start over.
Okay.
So, Mr. Polly, if I were to, I guess, summarize the question to the commission is, do we agree with block level variety? And if so, are we looking more towards one side of the street or for variety requirements on both sides of the street, regardless of the developer, where that developer line is?
Yeah, and I think I would add to that, would you be okay with backyard variety? I think generally from a staff's perspective, I mean, from functional and what neighbors you're talking with and interacting with from a day-to-day, you're talking, in line or across the street rather than your backyard neighbor necessarily until your fence blows down, right? So.
Yeah. Okay.
It just seems to me, we spent an awful lot of time last year talking about the overall spirit, the look and feel of the kind of neighborhood we're trying to create. It would just seem to me, in terms of both design and density, that wouldn't there be an overall level of acceptance of variety? In other words, if it's not an open season, a developer can't come in and just design what they want as long as it meets the density issue. There's still going to be design requirements or an overall look?
Yeah, there's still architectural standard, and that's what we'll talk about next.
Yeah, I just want to make sure we didn't lose that.
Yeah. And we can circle back if you want to think about this more. We can circle back after we talk about some other things, or if there's other comments right now, happy to take them.
It seems that we concentrated on the 60th as being the worst case scenario here, but I missed that. Across the road is park and school, so you're not going to have this issue there. It seems to me that allowing across the street flexibility is unnecessary. And it's that's causing this kind of difficulty of, well, then what happens if across the street is a different owner and all that? Have variety, period. No flexibility across the street. You'll have to have variety across the street just the same. Simple.
And I think one example that West Hills would bring up is where they have townhouses across, within central to development, they have townhouses across from detached homes. Is that enough variety on a block? Or would they need each side of the street to have some variety?
I feel like the variety comes in with the architectural standards and the actual category standards. I don't know that I care to specify that much variability in the categories.
Okay.
That's my opinion.
Go for it.
Yeah, I think I'm leaning more towards, it seems just a lot more restrictive to think about that, like across the street. I don't know, it just doesn't seem necessary to me. That's kind of where I'm leaning right now, but in terms of what's here so far, I think we're on the right track. And I'd be curious, you just mentioned like, future, like being able to understand like what we're trying to convey, past like different staff and things like that. So I'd be curious to test this language and stuff with other, staff members from different cities and things like that, just to get a sense of like, does this get at what we're trying to convey or the intention behind it as well?
And I think overall, we'll see more testing. We're going to continue to test some of these scenarios, and that will continue to refine some of these standards.
I think that'll help. Cool, thanks.
We also spoke last year about not wanting to have, for instance, along Stafford, all large buildings on one side of the street, that we wanted to break things up. And it just seems to me that's all part of what we're talking about right now.
Okay, maybe if it's okay, Chair, unless there's other comments, maybe we should move on and we can circle back as needed on this, but we want to leave time for some other things.
Sure, I guess real quick for me, I think I'm leaning more towards the street level variety and not the one side variety. And I think it would help if we had that differentiation between what it would look like if you had, one side of the street level variety versus both sides of the street. Because I could see 5 or less, then for both sides of the street, you'd have 2 units, but then maybe 5 to 12, you would have 3, where you're still giving some flexibility, but you're still getting that variety. And it's not just one single product the entire way.
Okay, thank you. And I'll just share this briefly, not to dwell on it too long, but I went to, this is a single family subdivision in Villebois that some of you may be familiar with that's under construction. And so I applied these standards to this and kind of see what we ended up with. So you see generally, and this one was interesting because naturally kind of half of it surrounding a park has larger lots facing into this park. The other side is smaller lots that are alley loaded. And so I think in this scenario, you still would see some division where, one side would obviously tend to be more townhouses and then the green here would be more detached homes. But you end up with the block level variety requirements and the overall requirements, you end up getting some of that variety on these other blocks, either the yellow being like townhouses and the kind of light salmon on this, as is shown here, would be accessory dwelling units.
But when we talk about variety, so you've got all green in the upper left, and in the bottom right you have all yellow. Is that what we mean by variety? The same housing type altogether, and then in a different part of my development, the same housing type in that part of the development.
Yeah, so I think overall, you're going to tend to, without the block level variety, you're going to tend to see that, obviously, because it makes sense from site planning and other reasons, where you have alley loaded, you're going to put one type of product versus where you have front loaded, you're going to put another product. And certain parts of the site are going to lend one way or the other on that. But it's a question really then on this block level variety is, how much do we want to break that up?
So that is the question, I guess, for us, is what do we want? Do we want more of the block level or do we want this? Because this to me looks like I've got all one category in one section and I've got a different category, my category 2 over here, and then I've got my third category over in this corner. So I've got all similar looking buildings in one spot. But because I have a lot that's large enough for others, as opposed to, green, green, yellow, yellow, green, green, yellow, yellow in the upper left-hand corner, is that what we want? Which one do we want? Do we want it at the development, or do we want it at the block level? I guess that's my question for the rest of us.
My preference would be the block level. I think greater variety is better than you don't have all the rich houses over here and all the little houses over here. You can just integrate them a little bit more.
Agreed.
I agree.
And I think that's what we've talked about for.
Yeah.
But you're saying this diagram, as you've marked it up, matches what you had on the prior slide, because it's in the 5 to 12 unit range.
Right.
So we would need to have more variety than what was proposed on the prior slide to achieve what you just described.
Which is a question, is that enough, right? Do we need to require even more variety on
This
the
I don't
block?
think is enough. I mean,
I don't like that at all.
Okay.
So then so go back to the slide where we were talking about that. Is that the block level? That is the block level.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are blocks.
So essentially how this played out is generally, this was based on block level, but I ended up, in order to get less than 50% of category D, had to introduce some additional like townhouses, like over on this block, that wouldn't otherwise be required by the block level variety.
See, that's what I think we're looking for, is that left-hand margin where you've got reds, you've got greens, and you've got yellows. So you got what, category B, C, and D, all in a block, as opposed to the upper left corner where it's pretty much all green. It's all.
Or the lower right.
Or the lower right where it's all yellow. Right, so we're wanting to make sure when we say block level variety, we're getting that left hand.
I think from my impression from this, the challenge is you're not seeing, most of this is around a park, so you're not seeing what it would look like on both sides. Sure. And so if you had, yellow on one side and green and red on the other, then in my opinion, I think that would be okay. We ended up seeing a non-standard.
Yeah, so for example, here on Cherbourg Lane here, not really my French pronunciation there, you have primarily yellow on one side and then green on the other. So you may be able to eliminate that yellow here and still have that green and red on that to get your variety.
That's if you're using both sides of the street for that classification.
Yeah.
So what happened in the lower right-hand side?
Yeah.
It's all yellow.
it's all yellow. Yeah.
How come you don't have variety there?
So, and that's about townhouse buildings, is assuming they're townhouse buildings.
Okay.
So they're all these little lots, but you're only counting every 3 or 4 as a lot because they're like 3 or 4 plexes.
But even still, they're not across the street from each other. They share an alley.
Right.
So that's slightly different.
So it is the visual. I mean, I can see what you're saying now that.
Yeah, it's helpful.
And there's some good, fortunately, we have some good examples in Villebob where you actually do have single-family homes and townhouses in row. So I'll get some more pictures of that. I think this will be a continuing conversation. So thank you for the input, and I think we got some good guidance of where to continue. And I imagine some of the public may have comments about this evening.
And can you cover very quickly the size of the project in terms of acreage and just kind of how far apart these areas are? Because those are not, I mean, our block length standards, those are not probably very far apart, really.
Yeah, I mean, these are that's probably 200 feet there, maybe.
So I just want you to keep that in mind too, because sometimes you think of this and it's like, oh, it's all over here and it's all over there, but the space we're talking about is also not that large.
Yeah. continue to use this as an example, maybe I'd encourage you to drive through Claremont and kind of understand kind of because it's hard to drive through one of the future neighborhoods in Frog Pond.
Yeah.
Make the colors darker, please.
Yeah.
I can't see it.
But I did like you using this visual to help explain how it would be applied, because that paints a clearer picture in my head.
Okay. So I'll touch on this briefly, and maybe actually for now, I think I'm going to, I'll touch on it real briefly. I think this may be something we can just come back to in a future work session. I think our limited time might be better spent talking, if it's okay, about integration of the ADUs and mobility limited units. But essentially just tying it to the plat, and the big idea is we acknowledge that there's an iterative development process, that the original developer may sell the lots later and they may want to do something else. And staff feels that's okay as long as they're able to double check and make sure they're still meeting the variety requirements. And that the other key idea is that this is something that administratively, we don't want to have to necessarily babysit afterwards. So it really needs to be in the deed restrictions about what is planned there. So it's enforceable beyond planning staff remembering to double check it, right? So. So let's talk ADUs.
Well, can I just make one comment?
Yeah,
for maybe you could bring back later on variety. I'd love to see if there's any data relating to affordability when you start enforcing all this variety. Because if we start forcing the developers to intermix all this variety, does it make their costs skyrocket and then make them not affordable anymore? Because there is some economies of scale when you have this similar sized units that are more repeatable.
Yeah, there is. So. And really trying to get a balance there, right? I think that's key, is where to acknowledge that fact, but also not let that run the show fully. But I mean, try to get that balance where we do have some variety, but where it's functional and developable.
Agreed.
Dan, it looks like we may have a comment from the audience, if we're willing.
Do you want to pause for that now, or?
I would say let's get through the presentation. I think we're almost done.
Okay.
And then you can open it up to receive public comment if you'd like to.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay.
We're going to take a break.
So accessory dwelling units, as you... So accessory dwelling unit integration, this is something, there was that specific memo that was prepared as part of the master plan. And really, this was a goal as part of the UGB expansion that really encouraging ADUs. So this was a big part of it. So that memo made a number of recommendations, and we want to bring those in here. That includes, one of those is to allow ADUs for all townhouses, not just townhouses on larger lots, which particularly can work well because you can have a ground floor ADU with a two-story unit above it. Remove any additional review process for ADUs, so we're reviewing ADUs just like we are other middle housing and detached homes. And also add some special exemptions for lot coverage and setbacks. Lot coverage in particular can be a disincentive for ADUs, but that disincentive, I mean, some level of lot coverage is needed from a design perspective, but the disincentive and inability to build ADUs doesn't really compensate for the added any design benefit of lot coverage in that sense, especially when you're still using setbacks. Most people understand like separation of building by setback, and so if you're still having setbacks, it works. Setbacks, really the idea on the setbacks for, excuse me, ADUs, especially when you're talking detached cottage size setback ADUs, is to have those the same as cottage clusters, which the state statute around cottage clusters allows them to go down to a 10-foot setback. That's the maximum you can require is 10 foot. And it makes sense to, I mean, similarly sized structure to have that extend to an ADU. Then we talked and those changes would all be citywide as recommended. Those would, under the provisions we have for ADU citywide, we would add those in. Specifically to Frog Pond East and South, again, those building our housing variety provisions to incentivize and not discourage ADUs, to make sure that it's really beneficial for a developer to put in ADUs in order to meet some of the variety requirements. So I will leave it just briefly on that. I know you've seen a lot more detail in your packets, and see if you have any questions or comments specific to encouraging and integrating ADUs and the direction we're headed here.
I'm in agreement.
Okay.
I like the fact that we're encouraging and not discouraging.
Okay. Other comments? Sounds like we're,
I'm also supportive.
it's like right direction. Okay.
Yeah.
Mobility-friendly units. So we had to start with, accessibility is a big term, and there's different types of accessibility. There's different levels of accessibility. I mean, there's true where you're putting the counter heights and the different grab bars and stuff in the restrooms. And really, we don't feel it's appropriate. I mean, if something ever that needs to go in the building code from a zoning standpoint, we're really talking about access from the public right-of-way into the unit, and the main living facilities, such as kitchen, bathroom. So really thinking through that, and we've talked about mobility. There's I also want to acknowledge there's definitely other types of mobility. Accessibility. There's hearing accessibility, and other ways to design for individuals who happen to have different disabilities. But really, we're talking about stairs here, and whether or not there's stairs to access different parts of a unit. So the definitions that we're proposing: full mobility friendly unit, this is your single level, no stairs unit, where, this is your cottage or ground level ADU or ground level apartment or elevator served apartment, where you get in, you can go into the unit, you can use a walker, wheelchair, whatever mobility device, and not have to navigate stairs. And the idea is maybe we're not putting in the extra wide doorways, but if there's a need for that, that is typically easier to retrofit a unit than needing to remove stairs or put a lift in to navigate stairs. We did put full versus partial. Partial, I mean, this is your master on main type unit where you may have a second level that's not accessible, but you have your bathroom, kitchen, bedroom that's first floor or served by an elevator that you don't need stairs. We hear it, that this is something definitely that's desired. 10% of the developable area for these type of units, but only a third of those need to be full mobility friendly units. So the remainder can be full or partial. So you can have the master on main, a two-story home with master on main on that. Again, this is an important one to really not push too far without driving costs, because the more you put on the first floor, the more you're consuming land, the higher costs go. Construction costs for a single level home are not that much less than a two-story home. So, because you have a lot of those set costs. So we want to be a little cautious on how far we push this to not unduly create more expense where where it's not necessary. So trying to strike a balance there as well. So wanted to get feedback on the general approach here, if we're headed the right direction, on approaching the direction from the master plan and the commission previously on integrating mobility-friendly units.
So are you going to make on the other one, you, as far as the types of different housing, you said based on 4,000 square feet or 4 acres versus 2 acres. Would you do the same thing here? Because if somebody's only building 7 homes, 10% is 1, and then a third of them, it's just.
It doesn't work. So currently, we haven't done that on a sliding scale, but if the commission feels, we certainly can look at those scenarios where it may make sense to, if it's less than so many units, you're just talking like 1 unit, or if you're less than a certain number of units, you don't actually require any, because there's still going to be generally that number of units available in the overall master plan. So you building one of your 6 homes to be mobility friendly really isn't going to move the needle overall for the neighborhood. So we can explore that more for sure.
Yeah, I agree. I think it would be great to explore those options, and I think we're moving in the right direction.
Okay.
Okay. So the struggle that I've got is just because you require units to be mobility friendly will not mean that the people that need it will be the ones that can buy it. And so I think that's probably my biggest struggle with this concept is it would be great to have mobility friendly units, but then when non-mobility challenged people buy those units, then there's nothing left for the people that are mobility limited. So would there be a way, instead of maybe having definitions of full mobility friendly, partial mobility friendly, maybe putting something in there that makes units easily converted to mobility friendly. So maybe 1 stair to access the front door instead of 6, where you can't put a ramp in that you can easily do as a post-development modification for the homeowner that needs it. And other things like that, where maybe you've got criteria that would make it qualify as a mobility friendly unit, but maybe it's not all the way there at development, which would help reduce the development costs, but still provide that concept of having units that would be available. And maybe then you could have more units that would be close to mobility friendly or very near it, that you could still get that result and actually have it be impactful where the people that need it could use it.
Yeah, that's something that can be explored. So thank you for that thought. And really, how many steps can you have before it's not? And what space do you need to build a ramp?
0. I happen to be permanently disabled, so I have some experience with this. And I also am at an age where I have friends who have just had strokes, who were very mobile before, and now suddenly everything is a challenge. So I think it is a really challenging question, and I appreciate your perspective on it, is how do you make sure that the units are available to the people who need it and can afford it? And in your lifetime, you really don't know when that moment's going to come for you.
Exactly.
And that's the hardest part. I mean, I'm mobile now, and for 25 years I wasn't, so I'm kind of going backwards. But I know what it's like.
Yeah.
Where 1 step is impossible. So it's a tough one.
You can adapt. But ramps are expensive, and you need expertise to build them. And
it's not even just the ramps. It's the bars in the bathroom.
yeah,
It's the it's just the accessibility to doing the everyday things that a person who isn't disabled or isn't diminished never thinks about. You don't realize the things that you do until you can't do them, and then you go, oh my God, I cannot cut with a knife. So it's tough. This is a hard one.
Thank you for that feedback. So it sounds like continuing to explore options in that area.
I do agree with Ron that it's hard to, the build it and they will come concept, I don't think applies, right? It's like just because we have these units available doesn't mean the people that need them get them.
Oftentimes, it's more the timing of who's ready to sell when that unit's being completed.
Right, or if we're talking about a 7-unit housing development, right? It's like, okay, I've got 7 houses for sale. I'm going to sell them to the first 7 people that want to buy it. I'm not going to be looking for somebody that has mobility challenges when I'm selling that one unit. Now, if somebody with a mobility challenge comes to me, I may say, this is the unit I would prefer to sell to you, but
I do think the direction of having the bedroom on the first, if there's 2 floors, having a bedroom on a first floor is a step in the right direction, because that is one of the sell points for seniors, is knowing, my daughter is in the process, and she's 57, she's in the process of building a home. She's already thinking about 20 years ahead and making sure that even though they're going to have a master suite, they're going to make sure that they also have a bedroom on the first floor that could at some point, if they need it, be converted to a master. So I think that is I think that's a real sell point.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for your time and attention.
So we'll open it up if there is any public comment that we'd like to have.
I would just note that if you'd like to provide, even though it's not do we care if it's not a hearing? I'm reminding myself of protocols in the moment.
You do need to fill out a comment card or respond with your name and address.
Okay.
As part of your comment.
Excuse me, Chair, I think also in the interest of time, they can speak as long as they can fill them out at the end.
Great.
That way we can continue the meeting
Okay.
quicker. Thanks.
Okay, see if I remember. Mimi?
Yes. Thank you.
I got it.
No spiders.
No spiders, that I can tell?
Inspection. Thank you.
I didn't inspect before I came up here. I have handouts, because I think visuals are very important. So, on this round.
Mimi, can you confirm that that mic is on?
The green light is on.
Great, thank you.
All right. My name is Mimi Dukas. I'm with AKS Engineering. I am working with West Hills Development. They have tied up the Azar property, which is located in Frog Pond East, located at Advance and Stafford Road. We missed the January meeting. We didn't realize that you all were moving quite so quickly. So good job for you for making progress. So some of our comments may be a little bit of catch up. I apologize for that, but we want to make sure that we participate in this. We have a few comments on some of the concepts that are being discussed. So we met with staff and talked through some of these. Some of our comments have been reflected in what you heard tonight. We appreciate that response to the dialogue. First of all, there is a list of minimum densities by sub-district. And as I understand it, those densities will be applied across an entire Stage 1 master plan. So we'd be able to meet the densities across whichever the bundle of sub-districts that we have. So the sketch that I provided to you, we show the sub-districts in the table at the bottom. We're not meeting the sub-district densities that are outlined for each individual sub-district. We've got more density in sub-district 4, E4, and we've got less than the minimum density shown for sub-districts E5 and E6. This sketch reflects what we've shown you before. We think it's a good plan. We have located the density for the project around the main street. We think that that's the active place. That's where you want your highest walkability. And so we think this is the right way to distribute density. We just want to make sure that that is in fact where the final code is headed. It sounds like that was the intent of where staff is going, but we just wanted to make sure that that was up for conversation, because as we understood it with the original idea behind the Frog Pond structure was to go on urban form rather than densities. And density is kind of a funny thing in today's world with middle housing. Density is not unlimited, but it's a whole new conversation than it was before middle housing. And that's true with the development standards as well. So there are some development standards listed for lot dimensions and minimum lot areas, setbacks. And I would encourage you to be rather flexible in the minimum lot size and lot area and some of those minimum dimensions. You are focused a lot on housing variety and affordability. Affordability is going to be a huge challenge. It's always a huge challenge with new development. The design expectations that you're putting into this plan, understand where they're coming from, but they do, as you've talked about, come with a price. So whenever you're putting on those layers, you need to balance out some of the affordability components. And so being less restrictive for your minimum lot sizes to even achieve your densities. The densities shown in the subdistricts can't be achieved with some of the lot dimensional standards that you have in the table. So it's part of why we wanted to show you a sketch. I would really encourage you, and it sounds like staff is headed this direction, to do some case studies of the code standards that you're putting together and make sure that they all work, because they might be a good idea in their own category, but once you start layering them together, they don't always work. You can't always achieve all the things. We also talked with staff about some of the open space ratios that were shown in the drafts. We understand that obviously we need to have the open space park within our subdistrict E5, that's shown on the sketch. But the plan also calls for 3/4 of an acre of open space within E4, which is our mixed use district. 3/4 of an acre is a lot of plaza. That is expected to be plaza area. That's almost 35,000 square feet. That is a lot of plaza. We're not opposed to plaza. We just need to make sure it's right-sized, and that we just don't end up with a whole bunch of strange hardscape throughout the mixed-use district. Along those same lines, subdistrict E6 calls for 3/4 of an acre open space, which is fine. The language as it's currently written says it cannot be within the BPA corridor. I'm not sure why it wouldn't be in the BPA corridor. Sounds like staff thinks that is something that can be changed. We would just encourage that change. We think that that's an excellent, efficient way to get our open space. You just want to make sure that it's improved and not just leftover space. Housing variety. This is probably one of the bigger topics, and it's a big part of why I wanted to show the sketch. We have a variety of housing types within the sketch. We have multifamily, we have mixed use, we have single-family detached front load, we have single-family detached rear load, we have single-family attached alley load. Those are mixed across the plan. Again, we place the multifamily adjacent to the mixed-use center. We think that's where you activate it. We think that's where you get your best walkability, your best mobility standards. But within subdistricts 5 and 6, we have variety through there. But a lot of those blocks have single types of uses. But if you look at the block face that you talked about before, there's a good amount of variety. And that's how most people experience going through a community as long as block faces. I think part of what you're looking for in variety is architectural variety, and that's achieved through a set of standards. That's not necessarily the same as housing variety. I think part of what you're trying to get to with housing variety is cost differentials, trying to get different social strata interacting with each other. I'm not sure that you're going to get as granular of differentiation between a townhouse social financial structure versus an alley-loaded small lot detached home. They're probably pretty similar. So I think you want to consider what that variety is really looking for. The densities that you're providing for, you're gonna get a fair amount of variety in a small format. I don't know that you're going to be able to achieve as much socioeconomic variety as you desire. So I would encourage you to focus on the architectural variety standards. And then on mobility, we have this conversation a lot in Hillsborough, and they term it visitability. So they've been doing it for a while. I think it's a good goal. I think the standards make sense. The exception to that is requiring the full mobility and turning that into single-story homes. Again, there's a big price tag for that. And if you require the kitchen, bath, and bedroom on the main floor, as Commissioner Gallagher was talking about, you can still have bedrooms on the second floor. It improves your price per square foot, it improves your financing, it improves your saleability, but it achieves that ability to live on the main level for visitors and for residents. And I think that's probably your primary objective as a total society. You just can't control who's going to move into which house or who's going to become challenged at what stage in life. But if you've got the components on the main floor, I think you've achieved a lot. So I would encourage that. So those are our main comments for this evening. Happy to answer any questions you may have.
Mimi, thank you. I appreciate this. One quick question that I have. So looking at the single-family front load, I guess specifically, do you see those as being viable to have ADUs on, given the lot sizes?
We had conversations about that today, and Dan Grimberg might be better to talk to that. It's more likely, and I know it sounds a little counterintuitive, it's more likely that the ADUs could fit within the townhouses internal to the structure. Regardless of the type, it's more likely that ADUs with new construction would be designed integral to the single building instead of what I think we all think of as a garage conversion, little separate cute unit, little cottage. It's more likely to be designed as a house that's a multi-generational house with probably a lockable interior door and then a exterior separate entry for grandma to sneak out and go have her evening cocktail with her friends. But they can still live as a family, or you can convert it into a rentable unit. It gives you a lot of flexibility that way. So as a builder, again, as a buyer and your resale ability, it's the most flexible way to design an ADU. It's still an unusual option. There's still expense to it. In terms of buyer demand, there's a segment that wants it, but it's not everybody. Yeah. But Dan can talk to that a little bit more.
Thank you.
I have a question about the Stafford buildings. Mm-hmm. They're all apartment buildings. Mm-hmm. I think we had a discussion, and I'm trying to remember, but it seemed to me we were more concerned about the look and feel of the buildings rather than the functionality of it. In other words, we didn't want just the same looking apartment building all up and down Stafford. Did I get that right? But we were concerned about lower, higher, just...
We spent a lot of time talking about height and how that we could transition that, making sure that it had a good interface with the street. that it wasn't a generic edge or a standoff apartment, that it had a good interface with the street. But we wanted to make sure that we could do a 3-story structure for the multifamily that would transition into the 4-story mixed-use buildings. So it was about that urban form and being able to transition that height. And again, that's why we have it along Stafford. Those 3-story buildings, we don't want them to tower over 2-story structures within the main part of the neighborhood.
Okay.
So it's about 3-dimensional.
Yeah, and we'll be talking about Stafford design standards in March, is the plan.
Part of the mix of housing type was, when we started talking about affordable housing, we wanted to make sure we weren't putting him in some corner out of sight, where it becomes the undesirable part of this neighborhood, so to speak. So you're right. We were trying to make sure that we are sprinkling different types of affordability and economic range within the neighborhood. We have talked about architectural variety already, and the design standards, I think, adequately address that. Even with your apartment buildings along Stafford Road, the articulation that we had talked about with the design standards should take care of it. It is a street that is looking for friendly frontage. But having said that, stopping to struggle with this idea of housing mix too early, I think, is going to be a challenge for us. I think we're trying our darndest to see if we can get to what we initially talked about. And maybe in the end, it'll not come to much when it's actually on the ground. But we have always talked about these things as being also learning experiences, that the next subdivision then will learn from this one and do it better. So if you have any advice on that, it would help us.
I learned something on every project, I assure you. Thank you.
Is there time for me?
Go for it.
Okay. All right. Dan Grimberg, West Hills Land Development, and Mimi, thank you for your remarks, and you've covered most of what I would want to say. I'm very concerned about too much structure. You talk about learning from every project. We've been doing this a long time, and we think we know some things. I'm not saying you folks don't. And I appreciate that this is, it's difficult to do everything you want to do. But the one thing that I know through real estate development is you need flexibility. You think you have all the answers, somebody thinks they have all the answers, it doesn't work. There needs to be flexibility, and creating, the issue that I've heard tonight is about variety. As a developer builder, we like variety. Some people be surprised at that. We don't want to, I don't need to point at neighborhoods, but 40 years ago, all the houses were the same lot size. They were the same design. There were 4 designs, 1, 2, 3, 4. We don't do that anymore. So we have multiple designs per lot size. There's architectural rules of adjacency. There's a lot of things we do to make neighborhoods look good, live good. And the more structure you put on that, there's reasons we can't do all the, like every third house is going to be something else, different size, different whatever. It doesn't work. There's different lot dimensions. There's different lot dimensions of the homes. There's a lot of things going on, and we have to manage all that. And if we're just juggling it and just trying to make it fit the code, that's not a good neighborhood. It's just not. And so somehow, I don't know if it's possible. We want to be part of the process. We think we have some knowledge that we could share to maybe take some brief time somewhere in this process and talk about, instead of yellow lots and green lots, which I'm colorblind, so I have real problems with that, but what is the housing going to look like? I mean, how is this street going to look? Not how, what's the lot look like? It's like, I mean, that's important. We develop lots. We want to know what's the neighborhood going to look like, feel like, how are people going to interact with each other? We're all about that. But if you put too much structure, it's just going to kill it. And you asked a question about, does this add to the cost? And I'm just sitting back there going, I mean, none of these developments are easy to make work. I don't know, I think people sometimes think this is easy, we'll just, do this, we'll try this. Like, no, these are razor thin margins that we're trying to make work, and all of these requirements add cost. And then the next page we read affordability, that's key. And I'm like, and we talked about this to Dan and Miranda yesterday. I mean, a building permit in Wilsonville, just so you understand where we're coming from, is like $85,000 a house. The development costs in Wilsonville, because there's high specifications for all the piping, the LIDA facilities, all these things, is the highest in the region. And we develop in the metro area, is about 20% higher than anyone else. The permits are probably 20 to 30,000 higher than anyone else, anywhere else. And then it says that a certain percentage are supposed to be affordable units, and then maybe you should be required to do 1,200 square foot units, and you talk about those permit fees and development costs, it's just like, my head explodes. It can't be done. It's not that we wouldn't want to do it. If we could do small homes and sell them at a reasonable price, they'd sell great. It can't be done. So if the code requires it, we can't get there. I mean, it just doesn't, it's got to work, and it's just not possible. So anyway, I don't mean to ramble on. We would like the opportunity to be part of the process. If there's somehow, a work session, we get like 3 or 4 minutes to talk. If there was somehow we could sit around a table and talk about things, just ideas, and we could show you what we're thinking, I think we could both learn, and we know where you're coming from. We want a great neighborhood. We're really excited about Frog Pond East. We've done 3 projects in Frog Pond West. We have 3 more planned. We want to be part of Wilsonville, but we need to be able to make it work, and with a lot of structure and requirements, it's going to be a problem. So thank you.
So I guess, Mr. Polly, Ms. Bateshell, I would say it's good feedback, and it's things that I want to make sure that we are taking into consideration, and how we can look at that and make sure that what we are doing meets our goals overall, and whether or not it's something that's going to be feasible. I like the idea of an example, development, because it shows a great example of what it could look like, and so maybe that's something that we can look at, from a staff perspective, is doing something like this to be able to give that example of here's what it would look like, and see whether or not everything pencils out from a numbers perspective, and then what does it look like, when you're looking at the development, and does it feel right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What makes my head explode is the difference between large developments like this and small ones. This looks good to me overall. I think this is a really nice layout. I know it doesn't meet our block level variety, but I think when I look at the whole of this, it looks acceptable and presentable, and I think fits our overall thoughts. But then how do I apply the same concept to a small lot? Because again, we've got 3 different sub-districts, and even though it's one development, it's 3 different sub-districts. How are we coordinating across sub-districts? And, you know, because, but I think overall this picture, I think, presents a nice layout for this land use across all the property that's included in this. Yeah, and I don't want to become onerous to a developer to the point that they can't build it and have it somewhat affordable. So I hear what you're saying.
All right.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Pauly.
If I may, I just want to confirm, do we have anyone online or on Zoom? Okay, thank you.
And for the record, Chair, does staff have a item number? We just want to note for the record that the rendering that was submitted through public comment, just so we have that. I don't know how you want to identify. We don't have a list of exhibits.
Work session.
Okay.
Do we do that if it's not a hearing?
I just don't know how, since it was referenced throughout the discussion.
We can
I didn't know if we just a note. I mean, it's now noted for the record that this was submitted into the record. I don't know.
How many attachments did you have to your staff report?
It can be attachment. I think there was 6 because we had all the different codes. So
we could include this as attachment 7, is that?
Or as P1, since we only have one public comment attachment, unless you have to have a specific numbering standard.
No, P1 would probably be fine. That's not normally how, I guess, we don't often do this, so. No, I mean, it's not, it can still be an attachment to a staff report just provided by AKS, but I'm also fine with it being P1. I don't know that it matters.
it'd be 7 if we added it as an attachment. That's true. Let's call it attachment 7.
Sold. Can I use my gavel for that one? Soon. Okay, good. Okay, all right. Moving on, we've got informational items, city council action minutes, and the work program. Any questions or comments from the commission?
I have a comment that's not related to anything that you just said, but I want to make a comment in general for our staff members here. I would love to see the city start incorporating primary bedroom instead of master bedroom throughout all of our standards, and I think Frog Pond would be a great place to start that. So that's all.
Okay, cool. Anything else? All right. Looks like we need a motion to adjourn.
My mic's on. I move. I'll second her recommendation there. That we adjourn.
All right, we got a motion, a second. Meeting's adjourned, 7:50 p.m. Thank you.